I'm going to talk about post-Civil War Army officer pay scales and force reduction. I'm going to explain that officers were paid excessively, and I'm going to show what Congress did to right-size the Army officer pay in 1871. Now, following the Civil War in 1866, the Army was just too large for a peacetime military. So the Congress reduced the Army to 80,000 troops with an ability for it to surge to 100,000. Now, it was employed mostly in Reconstruction duties and any protections required to the Freedmen's Bureau and their activities. But by 1868, Congress had declared Reconstruction over, and the Freedmen's Bureau closed. So with that reduction in need, the Army reorganized its force, and it consolidated its infantry regiments from 45 down to 24. Now that's roughly in half. Now when you get rid of half the units, you don't need nearly as many commanders. So the enlisted troops were allowed to leave the service, but there was still law that provided for a certain number of Army officers. So those excess officers, many of which were literally sitting at home on a roll called awaiting orders. And so those officers numbered roughly 500, a little more than 500. Now, each of those was still drawing pay. Now, your typical Army officer before 1870 not only got their base pay, but they also got extra allotments for rations, pay for servants, rations for servants, clothing, fuel, pay for their quarters, food for their horses. Any commanders also got commander's bonus, and if they had been in service for every year, 5 years of service, they got what was called longevity rations. So they got an extra meal per day for longevity in their career. Now you'll notice that the commander of the Army, William Sherman, he was making about $90,000 a year, which is that second column from the right. Now, in comparison, the President of the United States was only making about $12,000 a year. The Vice President, Speaker of the House, and Cabinet officers were making $8,000. So Sherman was making more than twice what his boss, the Secretary of War, was making, which I find excessive. Congress figured if they could get rid of those 500 officers that were unassigned, that they didn't have jobs for, they could save $1 million a year, so roughly. So in 1871, they capped the Army at no more than 30,000 enlisted men. They offered voluntary early outs for officers with 1 year's pay and allowances as a severance. Mandatory for retirement for officers with more than 30 years of service, and they did away with brevet ranks. Now, to me, I want to quote this portion of the law that said, it was unlawful for any officer to use any enlisted man as a servant in any case whatsoever. So now, without servants, there was no need to pay all that extra servant pay and everything that goes along with it. There's one more cost-saving measure. Plus, oh, by the way, slavery had ended, 5 years prior. So they got rid of that antiquated pay system. And so as you see a comparison here, pre-1870 to what it became in 1871. In summary, I analyzed one person's experience in the post-bellum economy. The subject of my analysis was an Army officer and how changes following Reconstruction reflected larger demographic shifts in America. I did this by discussing post-Civil War Army officer pay scales and the reduction in force, described excessive Army officer pay, and I described how Congress right-sized the Army pay in 1871. Thank you.